The American West wasn't just built on gold and gunpowder. It was built on judgment, harsh, cruel judgment that determined who belonged and who didn't. History remembers the gunslingers and the cattle barons. But what about those who were pushed to the shadows? Those deemed unworthy of even the most basic dignity? What happens when society's outcasts find each other in a world determined to break them both? And what terrible vengeance awaits those who mistake kindness for weakness? By the end of this story, you'll understand why some names were deliberately erased from our history books, and why others should have been carved in stone. Before we dive in, I need to warn you, this true story exposes one of the most heartbreaking yet inspiring chapters of frontier life that historians have deliberately overlooked. By the end, you'll understand why some people will do anything to rewrite the rules of love and dignity on the American frontier. If this is your first time here, I share untold stories of black heroes from America's past on the Black Rancher channel. These are the stories that deserve to be remembered. Hit subscribe now and ring that bell so you never miss these powerful tales of courage and defiance. Now let's journey to Montana Territory, 1885, where our story begins. Montana Territory, June 1885. Eliza Walker felt the stares before she saw them. At 32, she'd grown accustomed to the way people's eyes lingered on her figure, not with desire, but with judgment. She kept her gaze forward as she made her way down the muddy main street of Copper Creek, clutching her market basket tighter against her side. "Mrs. Walker," nodded Thomas Reed, the general store owner, as she approached his establishment. His greeting was polite but distant, the way most folks in town addressed her. "What can I help you with today?" "Just the usual supplies, Mr. Reed," Eliza replied, her voice soft but steady. "Flour, coffee, sugar, and some fabric, if you have any new bolts in." As Reed gathered her items, Eliza pretended not to notice the whispers from two women examining ribbons nearby. Words like sighs and shame drifted toward her, sharp as needles. The bell above the door jingled, and a hush fell over the store. Eliza turned to see three men enter, ranch hands from the Carson spread, by the look of their dusty clothes and swagger. "Well, would you look at that?" drawled the tallest one, nudging his companion. "They say the ground shakes when Widow Walker walks to town." Heat rushed to Eliza's cheeks. She turned back to the counter, willing Reed to hurry with her supplies. "Now, boys," Reed said half-heartedly, "let's keep it civil." "Just making conversation," the ranch hand replied, his voice dripping with mock innocence. "Been 6 years since old Walker died. Must be mighty lonely up in that cabin." He stepped closer to Eliza, his voice dropping to a stage whisper. "Though I reckon it'd take 2 men to get around all that woman." Laughter erupted from his companions. Eliza's hands trembled as she reached for her purse. "How much do I owe you, Mr. Reed?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the men's continued taunts. Reed named his price, avoiding her eyes as he wrapped her purchases in brown paper. As Eliza paid and gathered her goods, the tallest ranch hand stepped directly in her path. "Tell me, Widow Walker," he said loud enough for everyone to hear, "is it true what they say? That Walker didn't die of fever, but got lost somewhere in all those—" The store door slammed open with such force that it bounced against the wall. Every head turned. A man stood in the doorway, tall and imposing. His dark skin gleamed with sweat from the summer heat, and his eyes, sharp and unyielding, surveyed the scene with dangerous calm. Eliza recognized him instantly. Everyone in 3 counties knew of Solomon Hayes, the freedman who'd built the most successful horse ranch in the territory, from nothing. "Miss Walker," he said, his deep voice filling the now silent store. "I believe we had an appointment to discuss that mare for your property." His eyes flicked to the ranch hand blocking her path. "Seems I'm right on time." The ranch hand's smirk faltered as he took in Hayes's broad shoulders and the well-worn colt at his hip. Without another word, he stepped aside. Solomon offered his arm to Eliza. "May I escort you, ma'am?" For a moment, Eliza hesitated. Solomon Hayes was as much an outsider in Copper Creek as she was, though for very different reasons. Taking his arm would only give people more to talk about. But the warmth in his eyes, respectful, sincere, decided her. She placed her hand on his offered arm. "Thank you, Mr. Hayes. she said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "I'd be obliged." Together they walked out into the sunshine, leaving a stunned silence behind them. Once they were a safe distance from the general store, Eliza gently withdrew her hand from Solomon's arm. "Thank you," she said quietly, but there was no appointment about a mare. Solomon's serious expression softened into a smile that transformed his weathered face. "No, ma'am, there wasn't, but it seemed a convenient excuse at the time." He fell into step beside her, carrying her packages with ease. At 45, Solomon Hayes carried himself with a quiet dignity that commanded respect. The grey at his temples and the lines around his eyes spoke of a life of hardship, but there was a strength in his bearing that few men, white or black, could match. "I've seen how some folks in town treat you," he continued. "It ain't right." Eliza adjusted her bonnet, uncomfortable with both his kindness and his directness. "People will talk. It's what they do best in small towns." "That doesn't make it acceptable." They walked in silence for a moment, the only sounds their boots on the packed dirt and the distant laughter of children playing. "Actually," Solomon said suddenly, "I did want to speak with you, though not about a mare." Eliza glanced at him, curious despite herself. "I've been admiring how you've kept up your place since your husband passed," he continued. "Not many women could manage a homestead alone for 6 years." "I've had no choice," Eliza replied. "That land is all I have," Solomon nodded. "Which brings me to my purpose. The droughts hit us all hard this year. Your creek runs through the northwest corner of my property before reaching yours." "I know," Eliza said, her guard rising. Was this going to be another attempt to push her off her land? She'd fought off plenty already. "I've been thinking," Solomon continued, seemingly oblivious to her tension, "we might both benefit from a partnership of sorts. I'm digging irrigation channels on my land. With your permission, I could extend them to your property. Your vegetables would thrive with better water access, and I'd be glad to have your expertise in growing them." Eliza stopped walking, surprised. "My expertise?" Solomon smiled again. "Mrs. Walker, everyone knows you grow the finest vegetables in 3 counties. My horses are strong and my cattle are healthy, but I can't grow a tomato to save my life." Despite herself, Eliza laughed, a sound so unfamiliar to her own ears that it startled her. "It's a fair trade," Solomon continued. "My men would help with the heavy work your place needs, and you'd teach us how to grow proper food instead of the sorry excuses for vegetables I've managed so far." Eliza studied his face, looking for the trap. Men always wanted something. "And what else would you expect in return, Mr. Hayes?" His expression grew serious again. "Nothing more than what I've said, Mrs. Walker, just neighborly cooperation." Before she could respond, a shout from behind them drew their attention. "Hayes!" The tall ranch hand from the store was striding toward them, his 2 companions flanking him. His hand rested on his holstered pistol. "We don't take kindly to your kind interfering with white folks' business." Solomon calmly set Eliza's packages down on a nearby bench. "Mrs. Walker was just leaving," he said evenly. "Weren't you, ma'am?" Eliza hesitated. "I don't want trouble." "There won't be any," Solomon assured her, though his eyes never left the approaching men. "Please take your things and go on home. Think about my offer." The ranch hand sneered. "Offer? What you offering her, boy? Because ain't nobody else would touch what Walker left behind." Eliza flinched as if slapped. She'd heard such cruel words before, but they never hurt less. Something dangerous flashed in Solomon's eyes. "Mrs. Walker," he said quietly, "I'd appreciate it if you'd leave now." This time Eliza obeyed, gathering her packages with trembling hands. As she hurried away, she heard Solomon's voice, steady and controlled. "Now, gentlemen, let's discuss your manners when addressing a lady." She didn't turn around, not even when she heard the first punch land. Whoa, things are heating up in Copper Creek. If you're enjoying this powerful story on the Black Rancher channel, take a second to hit that like button. Your support helps these untold stories reach more people who need to hear them. Now, let's see what happens when Solomon returns to Eliza's homestead after that confrontation in town. 3 days later, Eliza was tending to her vegetable garden when the sound of approaching hoofbeats made her straighten, one hand shielding her eyes from the late afternoon sun. A rider was coming up the dusty path to her homestead, a solitary figure on a magnificent black stallion, Solomon Hayes. Eliza brushed the dirt from her hands onto her apron and moved to meet him as he dismounted. Her breath caught when she saw his face. A dark bruise shadowed his left cheekbone, and his bottom lip was split. "Mr. Hayes," she greeted him, unable to keep the concern from her voice. "I see you met the Carson boys' hospitality." Solomon's laugh was a rumble of thunder. "You should see them, Mrs. Walker." He touched his bruised face gingerly. "Though I admit 3 against 1 weren't the best odds I've faced." Eliza hesitated, then gestured toward the small porch of her cabin. "Would you like some water? Or coffee, if you prefer?" "Water would be most welcome, thank you." She fetched a dipper of cool water from the bucket she'd drawn earlier. As Solomon drank, she noticed how his eyes surveyed her property, not with judgment, but with a craftsman's assessment. "Your roof needs attention before winter," he observed, handing the dipper back, "and that north fence won't hold if we get early snow." Eliza stiffened. "I manage." "I've no doubt of that," Solomon replied quickly. "I merely meant to offer help, not criticism." The sincerity in his voice made Eliza relax slightly. She gestured to the 2 rough-hewn chairs on the porch. "Please, sit. Did you come all this way to check on my roof?" Solomon settled his large frame onto the chair that had once been her husband's. "I came to see if you'd considered my proposal about the irrigation, and," he added, his expression serious, "to warn you." "Warn me?" "Word in town is that Carson's men are spreading stories, ugly ones, about you and me." Eliza's heart sank. She could imagine exactly what kind of stories they were telling, the lonely, oversized widow and the black rancher. She had no illusions about how the town would twist such a tale. "I'm sorry for bringing this trouble to your door," Solomon continued, "but you should know what's being said." "Mr. Hayes," Eliza said quietly, "I've been the subject of this town's cruel gossip since the day I arrived 12 years ago, first for being too big, then for marrying James despite it, then for not giving him children before he died." She met his gaze steadily. "Whatever they're saying now is just a new verse to an old song." Solomon studied her for a long moment. "You're a remarkable woman, Mrs. Walker." "I'm a survivor, Mr. Hayes. Nothing more. In my experience, that's remarkable enough." He leaned forward, his expression earnest. "But there's something else you should know. Judge Carson has been asking questions about your land deed." Eliza went cold. Judge William Carson owned the largest cattle ranch in the territory and had been trying to buy her 160 acres for years. The creek that ran through her property made it valuable, especially in drought years. "My deed is legal and proper," she said, fighting to keep her voice steady. "James filed all the right papers." "I'm sure he did," Solomon replied. "But Judge Carson has powerful friends in the territorial offices. Papers can be misplaced." Eliza's hands clenched in her lap. "He can't just take my land." "No," Solomon agreed, "but he can make things difficult, especially for a woman alone." He hesitated. "Which brings me to another matter. I've been thinking about our situation, yours and mine." "Our situation?" "We're both outsiders here, Mrs. Walker. Both trying to hold on to what's ours in a place that doesn't want us to have anything." He took a deep breath. "I'm proposing an arrangement that would benefit us both." Eliza's guard rose immediately. "What kind of arrangement?" "A marriage of convenience." The words hung in the air between them like smoke. Eliza stared at him, certain she'd misheard. "I beg your pardon." "Hear me out," Solomon said quickly. "Your land adjoins mine. Together we'd have one of the largest properties in the county. You'd keep full ownership of your acres. I'd draw up papers to guarantee it, but as a married woman with a husband, you'd have protection against Carson's schemes." "And what would you gain from this arrangement?" Eliza asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Solomon's expression remained serious. "Legitimacy. A freedman owning land is barely tolerated. But a family man with a wife and a proper homestead? That's harder to dismiss." He paused. "And I meant what I said about your gardening skills. My men eat poorly because none of us knows how to grow proper food." Eliza stood abruptly and walked to the edge of the porch, her mind reeling. This is absurd. The town barely tolerates either of us now. If we were to marry, they'd make our lives unbearable. They're already trying to do that, Solomon pointed out quietly. Together we might stand a better chance against them. Eliza turned to face him. Mr. Hayes, do you understand what you're proposing? The danger you'd be putting yourself in? A black man marrying a white woman in Montana territory? I understand the risks better than you might think, Mrs. Walker. Something dark and painful flashed across his face. But I also understand what it means to fight for what's yours. Before Eliza could respond, the distant sound of multiple riders approaching made them both turn toward the road. Are you expecting visitors? Solomon asked, rising to his feet. Eliza shook her head, dread pooling in her stomach. No one ever visits me. Solomon moved swiftly to his horse. Get inside, Mrs. Walker. Lock your door. What are you going to do? He mounted in one fluid motion. Lead them away from here. Consider my offer. I'll return tomorrow for your answer. With that, he turned his stallion and rode not toward the approaching riders, but across her fields toward the creek, where he'd be clearly visible to anyone coming up the road. Eliza watched him go, his back straight and proud in the saddle. Then she hurried inside and bolted her door, her heart pounding with an emotion she couldn't quite name. The following morning, Eliza sat at her small kitchen table turning her wedding band, the one James had placed on her finger 12 years earlier, around and around. She hadn't slept. Solomon's proposal had kept her awake, along with the sound of horses passing her cabin in the night, hunting for a man who had already disappeared into the darkness. A knock at her door startled her. Cautiously, she approached and called out, "Who's there?" "It's Margaret Reed, Eliza. Thomas's wife." Surprised, Eliza unbolted the door. Margaret Reed, the general store owner's wife, stood on her porch looking uncomfortable and holding a basket covered with a cloth. "May I come in?" the woman asked, glancing nervously over her shoulder. Eliza stepped aside, puzzled by this unexpected visit. In 6 years as a widow, no woman from town had ever called on her. Margaret set the basket on the table. "I brought you some eggs and fresh bread," she explained, though she made no move to uncover the basket. Instead, she wrung her hands anxiously. "And a warning." "A warning," Eliza echoed, though she suspected she already knew what was coming. "Judge Carson was in our store this morning. He was talking openly about how he's found irregularities in your land claim." Margaret's voice dropped. "He says the territorial office will be foreclosing on your property by the end of the month." Though Eliza had feared as much, hearing it confirmed made her knees weak. She sank into a chair. "He can't do that. This land is rightfully mine." Margaret gave her a pitying look. "He's a judge, Eliza, and his brother-in-law works in the land office." She hesitated. "There's more. His men are saying things about you and that Hayes fellow." "What things?" Eliza asked, though she didn't need to. Margaret's cheeks flushed. "Terrible, indecent things. They're saying they saw him here yesterday, that you two were—" She couldn't finish. "Solomon Hayes is a neighbor who offered help with irrigation," Eliza said firmly. "Nothing more." "That's not what people will believe," Margaret replied. "Not after what happened in town." She leaned forward, her voice urgent. "Eliza, you need to sell to the judge before this gets worse. He's offering fair market value. You could go back east, start fresh where nobody knows you." The suggestion stung more than it should have. Go back east, where her family had made it clear they were ashamed of her size and her failure to secure a better husband than James Walker, a simple homesteader. Where would she go? What would she do? "This is my home," Eliza said softly, "the only real home I've ever had." Margaret shook her head. "It won't be for much longer, not with both Carson and Hayes circling." She stood to leave. "Just think about it, Eliza, for your own safety." After Margaret left, Eliza uncovered the basket. Beneath the eggs and bread was a folded newspaper, the Copper Creek Chronicle. The headline made her heart stop. "Freedman rancher accused of assault on Carson ranch hands." The article beneath claimed Solomon Hayes had attacked 3 men unprovoked and suggested an investigation into his land. Claims might be warranted as well. Eliza sank back into her chair, the truth of her situation crushing down on her like a physical weight. They would take everything from both of them, 2 outcasts who dared to own something of value, who dared to stand tall despite a world determined to shrink them down. She was still sitting there, the newspaper clutched in her hands, when another knock came at her door. This one was firm, authoritative. "Mrs. Walker," called a voice she recognized as Sheriff Mills. "I need to speak with you." With trembling hands, Eliza smoothed her skirts and went to the door. The sheriff stood on her porch looking uncomfortable. Behind him, on horseback, sat Judge William Carson himself, his gray mustache precisely trimmed and his expensive suit unmarked by the dust of the trail. "Mrs. Walker," the sheriff began awkwardly, "the judge here has some papers for you to look at regarding your property." Judge Carson dismounted, a leather portfolio tucked under his arm. His smile didn't reach his cold eyes. "Mrs. Walker," he greeted her, "may we come inside? This is a matter best discussed in private." Eliza knew what would happen if she let these men into her home. The papers would somehow result in her land passing to Carson's hands. It had happened to other small homesteaders in the territory, men and women who lacked the power or connections to fight back. She thought of Solomon's words, "I understand what it means to fight for what's yours." Drawing herself up to her full height, Eliza stepped forward, blocking the doorway. "No, you may not come inside. Whatever papers you have can be read right here." The judge's smile faltered. "This is a complex legal matter, Mrs. Walker. It requires nothing more than your honesty, Judge Carson," came a deep voice from behind the men. All 3 turned to see Solomon Hayes riding up, accompanied by another man Eliza didn't recognize. A thin white man in a city suit, looking distinctly uncomfortable on horseback. "What is the meaning of this?" Carson demanded, as Solomon and his companion dismounted. Solomon's expression remained neutral. "Mrs. Walker, allow me to introduce Mr. Harold Jenkins of the Federal Land Office in Helena. He's come to review some concerns about land deeds in this area." The suited man stepped forward, removing a badge from his pocket. "Sheriff Mills, Judge Carson," he acknowledged with a nod. "I've been sent to investigate reports of irregularities in the territorial land records." Carson's face flushed dark red. "This is preposterous. You have no jurisdiction here." "Actually, sir, I do," Jenkins replied mildly, "especially when complaints reach the federal level." He turned to Eliza. "Mrs. Walker, I understand there may be questions about your deed. May I see the original?" Stunned, Eliza nodded. "Of course, it's inside." As she turned to retrieve it, she caught Solomon's eye. The bruise on his face had darkened, but his expression was one of quiet triumph. 1 month later, Eliza stood at the edge of her newly expanded vegetable garden, watching as Solomon's men completed the irrigation channel that now connected their properties. The federal investigation had uncovered numerous irregularities in Judge Carson's land acquisitions over the years, resulting in his hasty departure from the territory ahead of potential charges. "Looks like rain coming," Solomon observed, joining her by the garden fence. "Good for the new plantings." Eliza nodded, glancing at the dark clouds gathering on the horizon. "How did you know to contact the Federal Land Office?" she asked, a question that had been on her mind for weeks. Solomon's expression grew somber. "Because Carson tried the same tactic with me 3 years ago. I had a friend in Helena then, a lawyer who'd fought for colored regiments during the war. He helped me secure my deed properly." He paused. "When I heard Carson was targeting you, I wrote to my friend." "Thank you," Eliza said softly, "though I doubt it's made us any more popular in town." "Probably not," Solomon agreed with a wry smile. "But they'll think twice before trying to take what's ours." "What's ours?" The words hung between them, heavy with meaning. Eliza had yet to give Solomon an answer to his proposal. The crisis with Carson had put the matter temporarily aside, but now— "Have you considered what we discussed?" Solomon asked, as if reading her thoughts. Eliza turned to face him fully. "A marriage of convenience, you said." "Yes, for protection, for legitimacy." "Yes," he repeated, though something in his eyes had changed. Eliza took a deep breath. And if I wanted more than convenience? Solomon went very still. What do you mean? In town, when those men were cruel to me, you defended my honor before you even knew me, Eliza said quietly. You risked yourself for a stranger. No one has stood up for me like that since James died. She looked down at her hands. I've been alone for so long, Mr. Hayes. Solomon, he corrected gently. If we're discussing this, I think you should use my given name. Solomon, she repeated, liking the feel of it on her tongue. I won't enter a marriage of convenience, not again. He frowned. Again? My marriage to James was arranged by my family to get rid of a daughter they found embarrassing, Eliza explained, the old pain surfacing briefly. He was kind, but there was never love between us. If I marry again, it will be for something real. Solomon was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was low and intense. When I first saw you in that store, surrounded by cruelty yet standing tall, I admired your strength. When I learned how you'd managed this land alone for 6 years, I admired your determination. He took a step closer. And when you stood in your doorway and faced down a judge and a sheriff without flinching, I knew I'd found a woman unlike any other. He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and took her hand in his. Eliza Walker, there's nothing convenient about how I feel when I look at you. The first raindrops began to fall, pattering softly on the leaves of Eliza's garden. Neither of them moved. The town will never accept us, she whispered. Then we'll build something better than their acceptance, Solomon replied. Something real, something ours. Eliza looked at their joined hands, her pale fingers entwined with his darker ones, so different, yet fitting together perfectly. She thought of all the cruelty they'd both endured, all the attempts to make them feel small and unworthy, yet here they stood, on land that was theirs, beneath a sky that belonged to everyone, two people who had refused to be diminished by the world's judgment. Yes, she said simply. Yes, I will marry you, Solomon Hayes, not for convenience or protection or legitimacy. She met his gaze steadily. But because with you, for the first time in my life, I feel truly seen. Solomon's smile was like the sun breaking through storm clouds. Gently, with a reverence that brought tears to Eliza's eyes, he raised her hand to his lips and kissed it. They called you too big, he murmured against her skin. But they never understood that some hearts need more space to hold all they have to give. As the rain began to fall in earnest, Solomon Hayes and Eliza Walker stood together in the garden they would now share, two outcasts who had found in each other not just safety or convenience, but that rarest of frontier treasures, a love as vast as the Montana sky above them. And there you have it, the untold story of Solomon and Eliza Hayes, whose union challenged the prejudices of their time and whose descendants still ranch in Montana today. History books may have overlooked their courage, but on the Black Rancher channel, we're committed to bringing these powerful stories to light. If this story moved you, please hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Your support helps us continue uncovering these hidden chapters of American history. And if you haven't already, subscribe to The Black Rancher for more authentic stories from the American frontier. Every week, we explore the lives of black cowboys, ranchers, and pioneers who helped build the West, but were written out of its history. Thank you for joining me on this journey. Until next time, remember, true worth isn't measured by others' judgment, but by the courage to stand tall in your own truth.